Who will be the next British Prime Minister and a change of political leadership in Europe? What does it all mean for Brexit? Hello, I'm Mike Walter filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. For weeks now, the United Kingdom has been trying to figure out who will be its next prime minister. After Theresa May failed to get support in Parliament for a Brexit plan to pull the UK out of the European Union, she announced her resignation. But she's staying on until her successor is chosen. The frontrunner to replace her as head of the Conservative Party and become the new prime minister is former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson. The other candidate in the two-way race is the current Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. Party members will decide the winner, and the result is expected to be announced on July 23rd. Meanwhile, there's a political change in Europe as well, but just this week, the EU nominating the German Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen to become Commission President. So what does all of this mean for Brexit, and will the UK leave the EU at the end of October with a deal that both sides can live with? Let's get to our panel. Joining us now from Oxford is Helen Thomas. She is the CEO and founder of Blonde Money. And from London, joining us is Joe Twyman. He is the co-founder and director of Deltapoll. With us via Skype from Rome is Federiga Bindi. She is a non-resident scholar with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And joining us from Beijing is Klaus Larres. He is a professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I want to welcome all of you to the show. And Helen, why don't I start with you? One of the things I want to talk to you about is these candidates, obviously, but also this campaign itself. It's mercifully short. I mean, here in the United States, we watch these 10 Democratic candidates debate one night, saw another 10 debate the next night, but this campaign's going to go on for forever. I was watching one of these debates in the UK, and Rory Stewart took off his necktie. That became the talk of the debate, and he was gone about as quickly as the necktie. We've whittled it down to 2. And I know in the past we've talked to you about Brexit exhaustion. I imagine people in the UK are pleased that it's not a really long campaign where they have to hear Brexit over and over and over again.
Well, it almost makes me smile to hear you say it is mercifully short, because quite frankly, to those of us in Britain, it feels mercilessly long. And that is because, of course, the negativity surrounding Theresa May had been going on for quite some time, well over 6 months, if not a year. And then, there'd been vultures circling over her job, and now she has gone, but we still have to wait through a long, hot summer to try and find out who this next Prime Minister will be. So although it may seem on the outside we are cutting through this quite quickly, actually the whole process is quite excruciating, not least because it's 3 years since Britain actually voted to leave the EU, and we haven't got there yet. And
he was, Boris Johnson, the frontrunner, was one of the leading figures pushing Brexit. What can you tell us about him?
Well, Boris Johnson, a man known often just by his first name, which, as celebrity tends to go, usually suggests quite a high level of recognition globally, if not nationally. He is most well known here for being Mayor of London, which was a pretty significant success. Of course, London is the capital city, very populous, but also not historically always the best ground for the Conservative Party. So his success in that election really it cemented his notoriety, because he appeared to be the politician that could reach across a number of different divides and bring together people of different persuasions. He is certainly a character.
Well, he's certainly a character, Joe. He's kind of an unusual, colorful, charismatic figure. A lot of people here in the U.S. comparing him to Donald Trump, and he does connect with the grassroots in that respect. But here's just some of the things that people have said about him. His sister says that he is charming and ruthless. A person who's known him for quite a while describes him as a sly fox disguised as a teddy bear. One of the foreign leaders who dealt with him when he was foreign secretary said he's impossible to dislike, but impossible to respect. And John Major, the former prime minister, in an interview I watched earlier today, says that his views are in conflict with reality. He seems like the Teflon candidate in that respect because he remains the frontrunner.
Yes, that's right. He's certainly a divisive candidate, and he has in the past managed to pull off a trick of reaching the voters that other Conservative candidates have been unable to reach. But more recently, since he left the Mayor of London's job and became certainly Foreign Secretary, but also involved with the whole Leave campaign as part of the Brexit debate, he has started to really divide opinion. And many people support him, many people oppose him. But in this election, the candidates have to win over, firstly, the MPs, and Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson were the two to receive the most votes from the Conservative MPs in the House of Commons. They then need to win over the Conservative Party members. And so it is quite possible, for instance, that a candidate could be monstrously unpopular among the general public and hugely popular with the Conservative Party members and win the leadership election and become Prime Minister. I'm not saying that is the case in this particular instance, but it highlights how different the constituency of Conservative members are from the general public. Boris Johnson is certainly a candidate who is different in many ways, not just from British candidates generally, but indeed from candidates that we have seen across developed democracies. And in some ways, he does have more in common with Donald Trump. But Boris Johnson, for instance, will not be drawn publicly on how many children he has. And that's something that I think even Donald Trump would be willing to discuss.
Well, you went there. His personal life back in the news again recently because of neighbors calling the police about a row at his place. How is that going to impact him?
Well, it depends on what you mean by impact. If you're talking about what impact will it have in the Conservative leadership contest, where he has to win over these Conservative members, I imagine it will have very little impact. For this particular constituency of voters, data shows us time and again that what is most important is the candidate's position on Brexit. Now, if Boris Johnson had been up against other candidates in the final two put to the votes of the members, then it might have been different. But against Jeremy Hunt, who campaigned to remain and then voted to remain in the European Union, Boris Johnson is seen as the strong candidate on Brexit. Couple that with his charisma and the fact that he is slightly different from many other MPs, that makes him very attractive to the members. Among the wider public, however, this sort of drip effect of questions about his personal life could damage him in the longer term. But it remains to be seen. He has done a very good job so far of managing to escape the harsh gaze of publicity on that. But it remains to be seen if he'll be able to continue that trick indefinitely.
Now, the current deadline for Britain to leave the EU is October 31st. He recently talked about the possibility of a no-deal exit with the BBC. Let's listen.
Is my own ability, I think, to lead us out of this mess. We will get ready in a very sensible and sober way to come out on October the 31st with no deal if we absolutely have to. But we will get a deal with our friends and partners that provides security for business, for investment, and allows us to carry on.
Okay, so that interview with the Sky News. Klaus, I want to bring you into the conversation. Johnson says, you know, maybe he can get a better deal than Theresa May got with the EU. Do you think that's possible?
Highly unlikely. Both candidates, both Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt, have said that they want to reopen negotiations with the EU to get a better deal, and only if that doesn't work they want to leave without a deal. They totally ignore that the EU and its representative, the Brexit negotiator Barnier, has said repeatedly over the last few months that reopening the withdrawal agreement, which is a binding legal agreement concluded in December of last year, that is highly unlikely, because it would mean that all 28 or 27 EU members have to agree once again to a new deal. And that is, of course, a very complicated process. So opening the withdrawal agreement, the EU has repeatedly said is impossible. And it's quite unbelievable why both Johnson and Hunt say the opposite, have been saying the opposite for many weeks. What I think they have really in mind is a political declaration, which also needs to be made by both both the EU and the British government. And that is a legally non-binding declaration about the future of the relationship between the UK and the EU. And here, of course, a lot of wiggle room is available, and here both sides can be very flexible. And if they mean the political declaration, that can be indeed newly negotiated. But it seemed that they were referring to Mrs. May's withdrawal agreement, and I believe opening that withdrawal agreement is highly unlikely.
Speaking of wiggle room, he says on the other side, to counter that, he says that a no-deal outcome is not likely to happen. That's what he had to say to the BBC. Let's listen.
And the way to get our friends and partners to understand how serious we are is finally, I'm afraid, to abandon the defeatism and negativity that has enfolded us in a great cloud for so long, and to prepare confidently and seriously for a WTO or no deal outcome. That is not where I want us to end up. It is not where I believe for a moment we will end up.
Federiga, let me ask you about that. You know, he's talking about defeatism and that sort of thing, talking about confidence, coming across as very confident himself. None of this Brexit means Brexit sort of thing. But will the EU want to try and help so that they can make it over the finish line and maybe turn the page in this chapter?
Look, first of all, let me say how ridiculous it is to listen to him as if he was on the moon while the British government was negotiating the deal. I mean, second thing, they are clearly both in electoral campaign mode, so they say things which do not necessarily is going to be translated into policy. Third, no, the EU is in no mood whatsoever to renegotiate anything. Actually, for the EU at this point, the more the UK is in trouble, the better the publicity for the EU itself it is. Fourth, we don't even know if there's going to be a Brexit. I was recently in Brussels, and, you know, bets are that it may not even take place because there's nothing else that they can negotiate, nothing else that they can do, and it's clearly a disaster for the UK. So there is also the possibility of maybe a referendum or something, but the only possibility for the EU to give some more time to the UK if they say we're going to have a referendum. That is the only possibility. They're going to listen to the UK. Otherwise, is what they have negotiated.
Klaus, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we have now, or we will have a new prime minister pretty soon in the UK. But apart from that, the personalities are changing. The situation hasn't changed at all. The withdrawal agreement is still very controversial, both in the public and among parliamentarians. And I can't see that suddenly the withdrawal agreement, which Mrs. May tried to get passed by the House of Commons 3 times, that now if Boris Johnson brings that withdrawal agreement back to the House of Commons, that suddenly there is a majority. You know, nothing really has changed as far as the facts on the ground are concerned. Only the personalities have changed. And I really see that intractable situation we have had in the UK now for a couple of years will continue. So in the end, the question is whether Boris Johnson, if he is the likely new prime minister, will actually go to the country and call for new elections. And that perhaps would be the fairest situation regarding the British people.
Joe, let me ask you about that. What do you think the likelihood of that is?
I think it's very difficult to say. It's certainly true that that the situation is not going to change much in either Europe, we assume, or with the parliamentary arithmetic. Boris Johnson will inherit a minority government held up by the Democratic Unionists, and that will not change with him becoming Prime Minister. What we don't know is how the public opinion picture will then change, because Boris Johnson will certainly not want to risk a general election unless it means that the situation in Parliament can be improved for the Conservatives. And so if, for instance, over a summer of negotiating and politicking, he can get a lead of substantial distance in the polls for the Conservatives and feel confident that he can hold on to that lead throughout a campaign, then I think we may see him calling for a general election. If, on the other hand, the polls don't really change very much, the mood on the ground doesn't change very much, then there's no point in holding a general election, because the situation could only remain the same and could get worse. It could leave the balance of power lying with the Scottish nationalists to prop up a Labour government, the Brexit Party to prop up a Conservative government, or the Lib Dems to go into some sort of official or unofficial coalition with Labour, all of which could endanger his position as Prime Minister.
Very interesting. Let's talk about the other candidate in this race, Jeremy Hunt. He keeps talking about surprises. He mentions Brexit was a surprise, Donald Trump was a surprise. Perhaps he can be a surprise. What are the chances of that, Joe?
I think the chances of that are very, very small. He is banking on the fact that he is surprising, when in actual fact all his behaviour up to this point has shown that he's anything but. He is largely predictable. He is seen as the continuity candidate for Theresa May. In fact, many are referring to him within Westminster as Theresa in trousers. And so he represents very little in the way of substantial change on Brexit, which, as we've said, is so important to the Conservative Party members. And in all of the polls that we're seeing, he is behind, but not just by little, by some distance among the polls of Conservative members. So for him to change things around is not impossible, but I think it would take a massive gaffe from Boris Johnson for Jeremy Hunt to win. It's very much Boris Johnson's to lose rather than Hunt's to win. Now, that doesn't mean that might not happen. There's still a couple of weeks remaining, and if anyone can pull a gaffe out of the bag, it's Boris Johnson. But I think it's a very, very unlikely outcome.
Helen, let me ask you about what Jeremy's had to say, because he has this multi-step plan for Britain to deal with Brexit. Let's listen to what he had to say.
If there is no engagement on this deal, if it's apparent that the Commission is simply not interested in negotiating, if there's no willingness to tackle the shortcomings of the backstop, and if there is no immediate prospect of a deal that can get through Parliament, then there will be no kicking the can down the road, and we will intensify and finalise our preparations to leave without a deal.
So, Helen, we have two candidates saying they're prepared to leave without a deal. What's the level of concern there in the UK about that?
There certainly is a lot of discussion about whether we will indeed end up over the cliff edge after October the 31st. And that is precisely because of the mechanics to all of this, which is that having triggered Article 50, there is a relentless process towards its destination, which is leaving the EU, and the only way to stop it would be to revoke it altogether, which the European Court of Justice itself has ruled would have to be unconditional and unequivocal. Therefore, of course, that would be a huge political step to take. Although 48% of the public did vote to remain, as we all know, it's a hugely divisive issue. It's still being discussed. If a government were to just pull the plug on it entirely, of course, that risks alienating 52% of the population, if maybe not more. So, you know, this inexorable path towards no deal does make it look like what certainly should be a central scenario for people to consider when we get there. And the reason you're hearing those comments from Jeremy Hunt is he's trying to point it out in a much more measured fashion, because Boris Johnson has been the more pro-leave Brexiteer. Absolutely, we're definitely going to leave, but considered to be perhaps not moderate enough in his thinking about it. So Jeremy Hunt sort of wants to leave the door open to it, but doesn't really want to endorse it, which is this issue that was identified earlier by Joe in terms of the comments they're making right now are for a particular constituency, their Conservative members, very different to how the general public is going to regard it. But I do think overall we have to look at no deal as quite a possible place we end up. I would like to make one point in response to some of the other comments we've heard from everybody today, which is about the parliamentary arithmetic. And while it's true that we have the same 650 MPs sitting there who did not pass Theresa May's deal, something has changed since we went past the deadline day, and that is a very angry public who in the polls are now backing new parties like the Brexit Party or resurrecting a party like the Liberal Democrats. It's now almost a four-way tie between four parties in a country where we've very much been a 2.5 party system. So for some MPs who may be concerned about their future, of their safety of their seat, who might be concerned about their career going forward, that might change their individual calculation should a new deal or something that looks like a new deal get presented in front of Parliament in the months to come.
Joe, let me ask you about that, because you do a lot of polling. You're hearing Nigel Farage, and these two, Boris Johnson and Nigel, very instrumental in pushing the idea of Brexit, calling Boris Johnson a guy who flips and flops. What about what she just brought up, the fact that some of these MPs might be a little bit concerned, looking over their shoulders? Perhaps there's somebody a little bit more in the Brexit column. Maybe we do need to get in line.
I think that's true. But what we have found consistently in the polling is that none of the approaches that have been proposed so far command support from a majority of the public, and indeed none of them have commanded a support of the majority of the House of Commons. I think that yes, some people are concerned by the Brexit Party, and indeed some are concerned by the Lib Dems. But I think the end result of that is that those who were wavering on the Conservatives will perhaps be more likely to support leaving, and those that are wavering on Labour are more likely to support Remain. And so the overall story remains the same. Potentially, but I also think that a bit too much notice has been taken of the European elections and the impact that those elections had in this country, putting the Brexit Party as the largest party. Those were the closest we have ever come, and indeed will probably ever come again, to a consequence-free election in this country, and it became a proxy on Brexit. And indeed, a lot of the polls that we're seeing now similarly are maintaining that proxy. I think in the context of a general election, the situation could be very different. But how the parties respond to that again remains to be seen. That is a big uncertainty. But I certainly wouldn't take anything for granted, whether it's the idea that the Brexit Party, the Lib Dems, will fall back or will gain support. These are very unusual times in British politics, and Brexit casts a shadow over everything.
Federiga, let me bring you into the conversation, because I want to talk about that European piece of the equation. But before I do, a big sticking point, of course, has been the border with Ireland, the so-called backstop, the Irish border issue. Let's listen to some sound from Boris Johnson on this issue, and I want to get your reaction on the other side.
I think it's absolutely vital here in Northern Ireland to stress two things. And number one, that we will under no circumstances have a hard border. There will be no physical checks or infrastructure at the border in Northern Ireland. And number two, we will make sure we have an exit from the EU, a Brexit that allows the whole UK to come out entire and undivided. And we keep our union absolutely intact, and we can do it.
Federiga, your thoughts on what he's saying, and is this still going to be a major sticking point, do you think?
It is the major sticking point, and he's trying to, as we say in Italian, he's trying to have the canteen full of wine and the wife drunk. You know, there is no way of having no border and Brexit at the same time, at least under the condition that they want. And what is interesting, I think, is the second part of his speech, because it means that he's afraid that in case of Brexit, there's going to be a breakout from the UK, namely Northern Ireland, but even Scotland or Gibraltar. So it's his implicit fear which is most interesting in his speech at this point. He knows they're a very big risk, and that's also why I still think there is a little possibility Brexit won't happen.
If I can come into
Yes.
the... Yeah, I think in the past, Boris Johnson has never shown much concern about Northern Ireland, but this speech clearly was an overture overture to the DUP. And as you will know, Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson recently were in Belfast to really try to win over the DUP to their position. And they promised all sorts of things, like a bridge from Northern Ireland to Scotland, like turning Belfast into a free port, which would undoubtedly delight the EU with tariff-free goods coming in and swamping Ireland and the rest of the EU. I think these are all tactical maneuvers in order to make sure that the DUP remains on the side of the Conservative and develops a better supporting role than Mrs. May was able to enjoy recently. Whether that, after the elections are over and once Johnson has been installed as Prime Minister, whether all these promises will be fulfilled, I think we very much have to doubt. These are tactical maneuvers as far as I can judge.
Joe, I want to ask you about Scotland. My daughter lives in Edinburgh, and of course we all know there was the Scottish referendum. Now it seems like enthusiasm for Scotland breaking apart growing. How do you keep everything together given this kind of climate that Boris Johnson is going to inherit if he does win?
Well, it's an extraordinarily difficult task. It is not outside the realms of possibility that in the next 12 months we could have another general election, another EU referendum, and another Scottish referendum. The SNP, the Scottish Nationalist Party, are dominating politics in Scotland and continue to do so. They are a committed Remain party and are doing a very good job of mopping up the support of the Remainers in Scotland. Scotland voted around about 60-40 in favour of Remain at the EU referendum. It was one of the most pro-Remain areas of the country, and there's a lot of suggestions now that the people of Scotland would prefer to be part of an independent Scotland that was in the EU rather than a United Kingdom that was not. But it's worth pointing out the same is also true in some of the polling that's been done in Northern Ireland. And indeed, there's not a lot of polling, but there is some data to suggest that the people of Northern Ireland may wish to be part of a united Ireland rather than stay in a United Kingdom that was not part of the European Union. And the risks, therefore, are enormous. And yet, when you poll the Conservative Party members and you say, what is more important, Brexit or Northern Ireland remaining part of the United Kingdom? What is more important, Brexit or Scotland remaining part of the United Kingdom? In all cases, they say Brexit is more important.
Helen, briefly, if you can, talk to us about the financial impact Brexit has had, and if Boris Johnson's able to navigate the country and get a Brexit deal, what is that going to mean for the UK when you may have somebody like Donald Trump saying, look, you got to do business with us and forget about China? You know, there's going to be all these different variables as the UK tries to cut deals.
Yes, well, certainly if a deal is done, then that closes the uncertainty over this deadline day. It means we can all move on into a transition period. It gives more certainty to business. And you would imagine that a lot of investment would be unlocked and the UK economy should bounce back quite significantly. Although, as you point out, the global picture, of course, with Trump fending off trade wars with the EU and China and pretty much everybody, that's not necessarily guaranteed. But as we've been looking at it so far, the UK economy clearly had a stockpiling boost that happened into the previous March 31st deadline. That is now unwinding, and now it's all eyes on the October 31st deadline. So it's actually quite difficult to get a real understanding of the underlying strength of the British economy, but it does, in recent data, seems to suggest quite negative factors in terms of at least the manufacturing sector and also still our huge service sector not performing too strongly. Of course, there is a global slowdown generally going on in the world, so really it's not the best time to have this huge question mark over Britain's relationship not only with its biggest trading partner, but then, of course, the knock-on effect to its ability to strike trade deals with the rest of the world. So right now, I would say the economic impact is fairly significantly negative.
Helen, thanks so much, and thanks to all our panelists. It's been a great discussion, but we're going to have to leave it there. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us.